it was like a temple in which there were all disciples and followers, and they were all sort of weak Xeroxes of him, or what in genetics would be called weak clones. And they weren't actually taking his ideas and imaginatively and individualistically doing original work with him in the way that that I thought I was doing. And you couldn't, with people like Bucky Fuller or Joseph Campbell or Marshall McLuhan, you actually couldn't be around them except in the form of a disciple kissing their ring. And I just wasn't comfortable in that mode, so I thought, well, the best way to get the best of these gentlemen is to read them in my study and integrate what I think is valuable in my writing, and then just ignore the personality and the ego and the ego dynamics of a cult of followers. So I went once, and McLuhan was very defensive and threatened by me because a reporter had said the intellectual center of Toronto had shifted from the south with McLuhan at the University of Toronto to the north of the city, to York University, to me, and so he felt like, and of course that wasn't the way I felt, that was just journalistic packaging, and so he felt like I was after his turf. So I went to the coach house as a way of, honoring him and saying, no, this is not the case, this is just an irresponsible journalist, and, I respect your work and I'm not after your, your bishopric. But he basically wasn't a highly autistic individual. He couldn't really listen. He could only recite brilliantly his aphorisms and insights. I mean, he was undoubtedly a genius, but he was a kind of autistic genius.
I see.
And the media tends to exaggerate that in people. Whenever I would meet people like Alan Watts or Bucky or McLuhan, Joseph Campbell, very much so. The media magnified their ego and put them into a kind of celebrity status, and so they didn't have the ability to listen or exchange thoughts and ideas. They only had the ability to play the tape recording of their ideas.
I see.
And it's better to get that just by reading it in a book instead of hanging around the person.
Sure.
So I left and went elsewhere.
Wasn't it about that time that you founded Lindisfarne? I was wondering.
I was getting restless with the university because York was becoming a suburban drive-in university and was trying to basically duplicate the technocratic vision of post-industrial society that had been pioneered by MIT. And so I took a sabbatical and I went around the world, and that was Passages About Earth, and was looking at alternatives because when I was in Canada, I went to a summer conference on Lake Couchiching, and Ivan Illich gave the opening address, and he was a very charismatic speaker, one of the more charismatic lecturers I've ever heard, actually. And he articulated the whole vision of the Counterfoil Institution and had set up his own Center for Intercultural Documentation in Cuernavaca. And so I decided to, look at these places around the world. I had already gone to Esalen in '67 and been very impressed by Michael Murphy, who remains a very close friend. And so I decided to look at Arco Santi and the Center for Eastern Wisdom and Western Science in Starnberg, Germany, and the Auroville and the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in India, and Findhorn in Scotland. So I took off and just went around the world and tried to understand the sort of new planetary culture that was emerging by talking to people like Aurelio Pache and the Club of Rome in Rome, and people in the World Institute, what's it called, the World Order Models Project for the Institute of World Order in Tokyo, and so out of all that wandering, I wrote the book, and from the inspiration of Findhorn and my meeting with David Spangler, I decided to get up my courage and not go back after the end of my sabbatical, and so I was promoted to full professor and said, thank you very much, but I'm not coming back, and so I quit and set up Lindisfarne in New York.
Has your vision of Lindisfarne changed any over the years?
Oh, yeah, it has to, because Lindisfarne dies every year. It's 24 years old, and it dies, every year for lack of money. So one has to be a bricoleur and flexible. You can only be rigid and inflexible if you have an endowment, and that makes you an institution, like Princeton University.
Yeah.
Lindisfarne has no endowment. It just has little tactical funds that a donor and individual give from time to time and for a program, and then I'll do the program and the money's gone and you're broke and you have to start all over again. So I've done that for 24 years, so Lindisfarne has changed. In the first wave, I was in the 70s because of the wonderful idealism of the 70s. I miss it in this kind of, materialistic 90s. The influence of the intentional community as a way of getting out of the suburbs, since I'd grown up in L.A., was attractive. And so Findhorn and Oroville and the intentional community dynamic, like Zen Center, Tassajara in California, these were interesting. And so I set it up as a kind of institute that was run by a communal staff. And we were involved with the usual kind of return to nature of organic gardening and alternative medicine and meditation and a lot of the agenda of the 70s. Then as it evolved, it became more a fellowship of artists and scientists and poets, and it became the fellowship that was really charismatic and dynamic more than the intentional community. And so that began to take us into the interface between spirituality and science. And so in the 70s, it started with Gregory Bateson and the astronaut Rusty Scheuchert, but that just kept growing with Francisco Varela and the physicist David Finkelstein, and then Jim Lovelock in atmospheric chemistry, and Lynn Margulis in biology. And so our program in biology and science began to be the strongest and most original thing about Lindisfarne, because Findhorn is very heart-centered but is intensely anti-intellectual. And Oroville is basically kind of a yogic, New Age, or that's the wrong word, a kind of ashram community. But it has no scientific component. So what was unique to Lindisfarne was this fellowship of scientists reimagining a new kind of science in which art, science, and religion collaborated in a more interesting ecology of consciousness than was the case at MIT. I had tried to set up such an interface at MIT, but they wouldn't let me do it, and that's why I got restless and quit.
I see. Could you describe what you mean by the shift from an industrial society to a planetary society, and what the new social and cultural structures might entail with that?
Well, it's basically the industrial nation-state arose in the 18th century, England being the kind of charismatic example. And it was a shift away from a feudalistic empire with all value based on land and an aristocracy and a church to capitalism and a basis on industrial productivity and new economic forms of exchange and value. So the industrial nation-state created the international world system we have now of the economy, the world economy. And this is, of course, creating all the problems that we face now with the industrialization of the biosphere, creating the greenhouse effect and the ozone hole, which gives us crazy things like hurricanes in July when they used to come in September, and 30 hurricanes instead of 3, and the inability of school children to go out and play in the sun in Australia. So the interface between an industrial economy and the biosphere is what in the industrial nation-state can't handle. So the new culture isn't based on nation-state turf, it's based more on biological, ecological processes. So the atmosphere is more the model than land, and the science that would describe the processes of the atmosphere are more the new complex dynamical sciences, chaotic systems of clouds rather than, the clods. So the old romanticism wanted to go back to nature, and you got a kind of romantic attempt to achieve the pre-industrial world of folk culture, romanticism in Germany and England. But I'm more interested in going forward out of industrial societies. So I use the word planetary to distinguish between international, because international is what I had at MIT. That's basically the relationship between the G7 and a commitment to technological modernization and industrial development, and that, of course, just exacerbates the problems we have now.